This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information.
I would say a key component is actually staying in your property and sleeping in it before you have your first guest, because there always seems to be something that you're missing, like there's a light that shines through the bedroom window and it keeps you up at night, or there's, the neighbor has a dog late at night and you don't know about it. So making sure your property is perfectly listed so that it meets the expectations of your guests 100% is a good, just mandatory step.
Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is Tim Hubbard. He's the host of the Short-Term Rental Riches podcast. He's been living full-time abroad, mostly in Latin America, for 8+ years now, managing a portfolio of properties abroad and teaching other people how to make money on Airbnb and set up short-term rentals, with a particular angle on abroad, international real estate, Colombia, Brazil, etc. So lots to talk about. Tim, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Vance. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Where are you calling in from right now?
I am in Balneário Camboriú, down in southern Brazil.
That's nice. How you liking it?
I love it. It's one of my favorite places in the world. So I've been last 3 or so years, spent about half the year down here. I'm sure it's going to stay that way too.
What do you like about Balneario Camboriú?
I like a lot of things. I guess I like the Brazilian culture. I think they're really open and energetic and friendly. I like a lot of Latin cultures. I like Balneario specifically because it's got a city vibe, but it's not like a massive city. So it's got lots of good restaurants. Of course, it's right on the ocean, which is nice. But you can walk to a lot of places, and it's just easy. It's just easy to live here, I guess.
And for the audience that I gave a bit of introduction, but I'd love to hear more about it from yourself. You split your time between Brazil and Colombia. Is that how I understand it?
Yeah, that's right. I guess I went to Colombia maybe 8 or so years ago, and I spent most of my time there. I guess the last 3 years been spent a lot more time down here in Brazil, but I the first place I moved outside the U.S., I guess you could say, is Colombia.
That's awesome. And I guess for some more context to the audience, I got introduced to you, Tim, by our mutual friend, James Guzman, the host of the Borderless podcast and also a previous guest on the My Latin Life podcast. So you guys can check out his episode as well. James put us in touch, and James he's been around for a long time. So I guess maybe he was one of your early inspirations, or you've been aware of a lot of this Flag 30 type stuff for a long time, Tim.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually met James at a real estate conference in San Diego years ago. And then, gosh, it was like years after that conference, I ran into him in Medellin in Colombia, and we ended up living together for like several months. And so we became really good friends. And now we're actually working together and in the real estate business. And so yeah, he's a good guy.
That's awesome. So he's based in Mexico. So you guys kind of collaborate, remotely.
Yep. Yeah, that's the whole thing. I guess a little bit more of my background. I started investing like 13 years ago in the U.S. In California, where I'm from originally, and started investing in other markets. Maybe 5 years into it, trying to find better investment returns. So ended up spending quite a lot of time investing a lot in Tennessee and Oklahoma, and sort of built this portfolio of real estate that was scattered around. And since I was spending so much time in Medellin, ended up investing in Medellin and now in Brazil. And so we've kind of figured out how to manage all that remotely. And that's, as you alluded to there with the podcast, I've been teaching on how to best manage short-term rentals remotely, but also, what I think makes a good investment and uh, all the nuts and bolts that go into those processes.
Yes, the short-term rental riches podcast. It's good. I'll have to say that a couple times to really nail it. But do you want to tell us about the podcast? Obviously, people are going to have to go check it out. We'll link it in the show notes. But I understand you've been doing it for like 3 years.
Yeah, going strong every week. They're quick, actionable, bite-sized episodes. Most of them are solo episodes, and it really started. I guess I just had a lot of friends asking me. Some friends were getting into short-term rentals, and they're like, "How do you manage your short-term rentals from thousands of miles away? And where should I buy a property? And what should I look for? And everything that goes into that." And so I sort of started the podcast as a way to just answer a lot of friends' questions and just kept on going. I really enjoy it. It helps me sharpen my business, studying the topics and everything for the show. At the same time, it's helped quite a few people, I think. So it's been a lot of fun.
And did you always intend to diversify internationally and buy international real estate, or did that kind of happen by accident?
I don't think it happened by accident. I think I've always sort of dreamt of doing that. When I I guess my travel bug got sparked when I was in high school. I went and lived in Spain in an exchange program in this city called Salamanca, outside of Madrid, and it just totally changed my outlook on everything I was used to. I weather and the food and the language and the culture and everything was different over there. So I wanted to be able to travel always, right? And that's kind of how I stumbled on real estate, because I had heard it was a way to earn passive income and to be able to travel. And so I've always wanted to travel. And then after I discovered real estate, I've just kind of naturally, everywhere I've gone, I always look at real estate, and I think Medellin, where I first invested internationally, has a lot of opportunity, and it's a place that's, gosh, I'd say it's just grown out of control now, especially after COVID. But I've never seen so many foreigners down there, which is great for a real estate market, especially one that sort of has a limited land now. Medellin's like really built in, and there's not a ton of space left. So yeah, I guess since I got the travel bug, I've always kind of been looking in other places to invest every time I travel somewhere.
Yeah, I was recently in Medellin and I enjoyed it. It was cool.
Yeah, I love that place. It's still, well, I still spend half the year there now, just basically half here and then half in Medellin, and then usually we travel a little bit, explore some new places every year. But I mean, beautiful weather, really nice people as well. I think Colombians are super nice, very affordable, especially compared to the U.S. And it's close to the U.S. So for a lot of people that are living in the U.S., it's just 3 hours from Florida and direct flights every day, so it's pretty accessible too.
And then when you thought about Brazil, how did that enter the equation? Because Medellin, yeah, like a fair amount of people talk about investing in apartments in Medellin and Bogota, but not too many people are willing to take that plunge of getting into the Brazil market because it's just probably a little bit hairy, a little bureaucratic.
Yeah, no, it was a little challenging investing here. I've only bought one property so far, but I think this specific city where I'm at has just got some really unique opportunity. They're calling it the Dubai of South America, and they're building the tallest building in all of South America. Actually, the tallest residential building in the world that's fully residential. So there's taller buildings, but most of them are commercial mixes. So they have these massive, massive buildings down here, especially for the size of this city. There's only like 250,000 people that live here full time, but a lot of rich Brazilians are sort of investing here. And a lot of these apartments, I mean, they're like a million, $5 million. It's out of control. And I think there is a lot of opportunity here because you have these brand new buildings going up that are super expensive per square meter. But then at the same time, you have a lot of existing buildings where you can buy a slightly older property at a fraction of the cost per square meter. And it's sort of landlocked here, like San Francisco, where there's no more room to build really. So I think there's some really unique opportunity here in Brazil. It's also really safe too, which I think is something that's important to look at when investing in a market like Rio de Janeiro, for example. I really like Rio as well, but it's and I don't want to say that it's like totally unsafe or anything like that, but it is surrounded by more favelas where the difference in income, between the favelas and the people living in Rio is really large. And you don't really have that here in Balneario Camboriú. Like that, there are no uh, favelas and stuff nearby. And so it's one of the safest places I think I've found as well.
And how did you stumble upon Camboriú as opposed to? I'm sure you've probably been around. You've been to Floripa and maybe some other spots, but how did you kind of decide that Camboriú was the spot for you?
I so I came down here with a friend, one of my neighbors in Medellin, and we came down. We had like a month planned just to sort of, where he's working virtually as well, and we got stuck here because of COVID. Colombia closed their borders, and we couldn't go back, and they actually closed the airline closed down for a little while, Copa Airlines. And so they canceled our flight and we were kind of just stuck here. And so we ended up renting a house in Floripa and we lived there for several months and sort of discovered Balneario, I think, at that same time. But it was also from a friend's advice, a friend that I met in Colombia that had been spending a lot of time in Brazil. And he said, man, you got to check out this city. If it's like the Medellin of Brazil, or so we checked it out, and that's kind of how it started, I guess.
The Medellin of Brazil or the Dubai of Brazil?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's impressive if you just go to Google and you type in Balneario Camboriú. It is a really. It did take me a long time to figure out how to say that name. By the way, it's not the easiest name to pronounce, but if you search for it in Google, I mean, it's really impressive. It's like partially on this peninsula. It's curved. It kind of looks like a Miami, and it just pops out of nowhere. And I don't think you don't see a lot of tourists here. They don't speak much English at all, which I'm sure is probably one reason. It's also a little further. Like Floripa has an airport. There is an airport here that's about 45 minutes away, Navegantes, but I think it's like one extra flight for anyone that's going to Sao Paulo or going to Rio, and so it's a little less discovered, I would say too.
We do have one previous podcast guest that lives in Floripa. His name's Adil Maf. He's a Moroccan guy who works online with crypto and stuff. I want to say it was episode 17, something like that. People can go look it up. But yeah, cool guy. I think he's still there. What he does, he like rips around on a longboard because I guess on the boardwalk there's like a bike lane, and he's he's got like some like electric longboard. He's just ripping to the gym and stuff.
Yeah, there's so many. I have a little electric scooter here, but it's like I think it's fast. I mean, I drive it in the road and it goes it goes faster and like traffic a lot of times, depending on what the speed limit is.
Yeah. So, how do you think about like short-term rentals? And let's say we have a lot of American listeners. I'd say half our audience is American easily, and
Hmm.
there it maybe tilts a little bit younger on the audience. And so people might still be thinking about purchasing their first home, or maybe they have one. And yeah, that I think everyone realizes that short-term rentals could definitely be a good model. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, maybe you could kind of kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I got started with investing in short term rentals because I was just looking for higher returns. And I still have long term rentals, and that's where I started, long term leases, year plus. But it's just really hard to invest in a long-term rental these days and have any sort of like positive cash flow. And so I started investing in short-term rentals about 8 years ago, just because I was actually looking, I was in a market looking at long-term rental investments, and I was staying in a short-term rental. And I looked up the price of the property I was staying in because it was a new construction. And I knew what I was paying for it. And I was comparing those returns to the ones that I was looking at a long term rental. And I mean, they were like 5 times more. And I was already really familiar with short term rentals because I had stayed in dozens and dozens of them through my travels. And so I kind of just switched and I started looking for properties that made sense as short term rentals, but that were also affordable. And it's been a long time now. That was over 8 years. I think, we've managed over like 25,000 guests in my portfolio. So we've really grown and learned a lot. But
25,000 guests you've had?
yeah, yeah,
What?
I
That's a
think
lot of properties. I mean, how many guests can one unit even have in a year? Like 365, really? I mean,
yeah.
well,
Well,
multiple people, yeah, but damn.
if you take, our average reservation is like 3 days or even slightly less. And so you get a couple few people coming in, and I've got dozens of properties in my portfolio now. So it just adds up over the years. It's quite the operation. Um,
Okay, and so how many do we have, or when are you at your peak now, or did you have like a previous peak and kind of trimmed down?
no, no, no. I'm still growing slowly but surely. I have about we're managing now too, so I think we have about 75 properties, and then I have about 60 in my personal portfolio. Some of those are long term rentals,
Like
but
60 additional or 60 of the 75?
60 of the 75.
Okay, so like 60
Yeah.
self-managed and then
hmm
a bunch where you're managing for other people.
Yeah, yeah, we actually just started managing for other people, which is cool. I mean, we just manage them the exact same way that I manage my properties. We've got a big reception team, and we've got people that specialize in review management and just really kind of every aspect of a short term,
Okay.
reservation,
Yeah, I
marketing, the whole
definitely want to
nine.
get into everything that goes into that experience. But first, so you mentioned that when you were buying properties originally, it was in Nashville and in Oklahoma. Did things change, I imagine, when you started adopting the short-term rental strategy?
So I started originally in Sacramento, California, where I'm from. And I actually still have short term rentals there, but I've sold most of the properties, and I invested a lot in Memphis, Tennessee, and then in Oklahoma afterwards. And I know a lot of times people are like, "What? Why would someone want to go to Memphis? Why would someone want to go to Oklahoma City?" And there's lots of reasons. They're relatively big cities, and people go for medical, they go for work, they go to visit family, they go to visit their children at school, they go because maybe they're moving there. And those also happen to be affordable markets, which we've seen a huge shift in demographics in the US over the last really like 10, 15 years of people moving to more affordable markets like Florida and Texas and Tennessee. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that all those markets are affordable now. I mean, like Austin blew up, for example, Tampa blew up, and they're much more expensive than they were, but they still are more affordable than quite a few other places, especially a lot of places in California. And so I think that's a really good trend. I think that's going to continue. If someone's looking to invest right now, I think affordable markets are where are the best opportunity, especially with the way inflation is, and people are kind of getting squeezed, and they're just some people kind of forced to move, and with people being able to work remotely, they have a little more flexibility, and so lots of reasons people stay in a short-term rental. I think sometimes when someone thinks of Airbnb, they just think of like vacations, but the reality is that people are living in short-term rentals now. They're not just used for short-term stays and travel.
I'm basically at the point where I'm still living out of Airbnbs.
Hmm.
So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I just sold my place in Colombia. We're working on another project there, but when I go back, I'm going to be running an Airbnb while we build things out over there. So it's just the way people have lived and work is totally
Hmm.
changed.
Yeah, I was gonna say like I think any digital nomad kind of gets it because especially in Latin America, there's such a huge gap between like a traditional long-term lease, the price that you might get versus if you're doing it on Airbnb, right? You know, you go to
Hmm.
Mexico, if you were there locally, you could probably pay like 600 bucks a month, 800 bucks a month,
Hmm.
but Airbnb is going to be double that.
Yeah,
And people kind of like see that arbitrage opportunity. And I
totally.
guess it's the same thing in the States too. Like a night on Airbnb never gets like that cheap. Like it's always still like, you know, 70
Yeah,
bucks a
no, that's
night or
true.
whatever it is. And so if the house is cheaper, you're just kind of having a better return, right?
Yeah, no, that's totally true. Um, Yeah, it's interesting too. There is sort of like this
Floor.
floor price that doesn't really go below. I think a lot of times too is because like the hotels don't go below that price, and that's kind of where a lot of short term rentals are competing too. Depending on the size of the short term rental, but like a one bedroom, for example, is going to compete a lot more with a traditional hotel room, and um, so yeah, and it used to be that you could find Airbnbs were much more affordable, but now you have some that are way more expensive than hotel rooms. A lot of people are
Supply
looking
and
for the
demand.
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of people are looking for the experience too, and short term rentals I think are able to offer that a little more easily than a hotel. You can't rent a hotel
Yeah. Yeah.
treehouse or
No,
type
I get it.
so
So we get it. So
yeah.
how do you start getting into it? How do you start getting into this market? I think uh one of the big unknowns I would say would be getting that short-term rental license. And as you alluded to,
Mhm.
the the price that you're paying for that home only makes sense if you can do short-term rentals because it's not
Mhm.
enough on a long-term rental basis to cover the cost of the mortgage in a lot of cases these days, right? So it's like you're
Yeah.
really depending on being allowed to do short-term rental and having that work out because your backup is not that great, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you got to be careful with that. That's a big difference between traditional real estate investments and short-term rentals is that if there aren't regulations in place, there could be one day. And so I think there's a few ways you can kind of break it up. There's the areas where you already know what the rules are. You go in, you can apply for a permit, you get a permit. There's the areas that have like said no and you can't get a permit, which those are easy to cross off the list. It's also interesting to look at those markets. Most of the ones that have said Airbnbs are not allowed are not markets that I would want to invest in anyways, because they're usually the most expensive because they have housing shortages. A lot of times the housing shortages are what create the short-term rental regulations. So, if you look at like Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle or New York, those are all places with really big housing shortages that also have really harsh short-term rental regulations. And they also happen to be really expensive.
So where are you looking for units? Are you looking kind of in the city limits, like in the city limits of Memphis or Oklahoma, or are you
Mhm.
looking for stuff that's like an hour out in the middle of nowhere and but you're the only game in town?
I so when I first started, I was investing in midtown areas. Actually, the name of my property management company is Midtown Stays. So basically, all of my properties are in urban areas. They're not in downtown, where it's super dense. And they're also not like out in the suburbs where they're far from restaurants and entertainment. So they're kind of right in the middle there.
The
And
sweet
I
spot
found
where it's like
that
walkable.
exactly, yeah. And it's also a sweet spot, I think, because a lot of times you can find those properties that don't have the downtown prices. They're slightly uh, less expensive, but they're still really desirable for a lot of different reasons for someone traveling or wanting to live there. Actually, I mean that's kind of where I was living at the time when I started. It's like that's what I liked, and so I was investing in those types of properties. So I like those types of properties because they also lend themselves to long-term rentals. If for some reason a city passed a regulation and they said you can't do short-term rentals in here anymore, that's one of my backup plans, is just to put a long-term tenant back in them, or to rent. A lot of times you can get around those short-term rental regulations if you rent a medium-term stay. So over 30 nights usually isn't considered a short-term rental anymore. And so we're seeing a lot of longer reservations, just like you and I staying or traveling or living in Airbnbs. A lot of other people are doing that, traveling nurses, and it's actually Airbnb's fastest growing segment are their long term stays. So I think 20% of all their reservations are for a week or more. Oh no, I'm sorry. 50% of all their reservations are for a week or more, and then 20% of all the reservations on Airbnb are for a month or more, and that segment's growing. So,
Do you think that there's a potential in that market for like the multi-month rentals? Because I definitely think there is.
oh yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of perks to it. For one, there's way less operations. Usually when someone checks into your property, all most of their questions are going to happen right in the beginning, maybe the first couple days, and then after that, they're comfortable, they already know everything. Uh, but on and then you have less housekeeping operations. If it's over a month, you don't have short-term rental regulations. You also don't have to pay the transient occupancy tax, which sometimes can be like 12%. So you can factor that into your returns. But there are things that you need to consider if it's a longer term stay, because it changes from being a guest to a tenant. And if you're in a state or a city that has really sort of like one-sided landlord tenant laws, someone like in California, for example, I pick on California a lot, but that's where I'm from originally. Someone wanted to, they could stay in your property for 6 months without paying, because they know how to kind of get around the system as a tenant, but they can't do that as a guest. So it's just a couple other things we need to consider, but I think I think there's a ton of opportunity in that medium term stay area.
Yeah, let's talk about your operations. Like, how do you set it up for the guests at this point? Do you like do you request a copy of an ID for every guest?
We do for every reservation we take outside of Airbnb. So we have our own direct booking website. We have reservations through booking.com and VRBO and HomeAway. And so for all of those sites where we're actually collecting someone's payment, we have them fill out a check-in form, which requires their ID as well. And we use a digital software to make sure we get it signed and everything. We don't for Airbnb though, because they do have slightly better protection and um, with their air cover and some of their insurance and stuff. So,
Hmm. And speaking of insurance, did you have any troubles insuring like such a large fleet of homes? And I guess maybe did you try to get like some sort of package deal, or are they like, do they all have like their individual insurance? You must roll it all into one big claim, I imagine,
they're
or like one
actually
big
they're actually
contract.
divided. A lot of the properties are in smaller multifamily buildings, so like 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12 unit size buildings, and they have their own commercial insurance policy. So the commercial side is what helps out with Airbnb, short term rentals. We have liability protection. There is a company that specializes, well, actually, there's a couple of companies now that specialize in short term rental insurance. One is called Proper Insurance. And so I have some policies with them as well. But yeah, they are all pretty much separate at the moment.
And so do you typically have the whole building, or do you have units in buildings where, there's a board and the board can potentially like accept or deny having Airbnb, or do you try to always get like standalone buildings?
So yeah, all my properties, I own the buildings. I do have some properties that I have short term rental units in and also long term. So they're kind of mixed. I don't have actually the only property I have that has an HOA, which is something we got to be careful of. I mean, a lot of times the HOA restricts short term rentals, but this property in Brazil has an HOA, and but they're totally open to short term rentals, so there's no issue there. But yeah, that is another, like we've got to check the city regulations, and if you have a property that's got an HOA, then you got to make sure you check the HOA regulations as well. And that's something that can change. You can have one day it's allowed, and then maybe you have a majority vote on the board and they change it, and then one day you can't. So just another thing to be cautious of.
And so, how much leverage are you applying in the States?
So I'm a big fan of leverage. Actually, that's why I still think for anyone that wants to is looking to invest or invest more, like we just have an amazing opportunity in the U.S. I mean, you can't. That's one of the big differences when you start investing outside of the U.S. You can't get leverage as a foreigner. I mean, I don't know of any place where you can, and so you have to pay cash, and that just totally changes the dynamic of your investment. But in the US, I know interest rates are much higher than they were just a year ago, but we still have decent financing options. Actually, much better than natives of, like, down here in Brazil, for example. If someone wanted to get a home loan, I mean, they're probably going to pay 10 to 12%, and it's always been like that. Where in the U.S. we're just now getting into the higher rates, and everyone's it's definitely higher, and it's harder to find a good investment, but it's still reasonable. Um, but I like the U.S. too because there's a nationwide housing shortage. We haven't built enough properties, and of course that depends on the market. Some markets maybe have built too much, but I think the affordable places where people have been rushing into, they still need more housing. And so if more people move into affordable places, if you're in a market that doesn't have enough housing, then that's really good setup for an investment. And yeah,
Hmm.
I would use financing. I mean, the thing is, interest rates are higher now, but if you find an investment that works right now with today's interest rates, then that's fantastic. I always recommend long-term fixed financing. And then maybe one day down the road, in a year or 2 years, interest rates go back down. You can always refinance, and then your investment just got even better.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. So, I guess that's the trick is finding something that makes sense in today's environment with, 5% plus interest rates.
Yeah, it's not as easy as it was just a year ago, but um, the nice thing about investing in real estate is that the numbers always tell us what to do, right? So we know how much a property costs. We know how much our loan payment will be if we're working with a lender. We know how much property taxes are. So we can have a real good idea of what all of our expenses are, and we also have some really good tools to estimate our short term rental income too. There's a company called AirDNA.co, for example, where you can look up any
Mhm.
zip code and you can see all the available units, what they've rented for, and so you can get a really good idea. I would always use that information conservatively, but I mean, we can plug in those numbers and we can plug in our expenses. And if the deal makes sense, then it's worth looking into. And if it doesn't make sense, then we keep on looking. So,
Yeah. How do you do your projections and stuff like that? Because I assume you're looking at units that are not yet being rented on a short-term basis, right? So you're looking at
mhm,
something based on, its long-term cap rate, and then you have to come in with a little bit of creativity and probably say like, "Oh, we're gonna like, spice this up for Airbnb, get a new couch, blah blah blah."
mhm.
Invest a bit in the listing, put it out there. So it takes a little bit of like a creative eye, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, I most of my investments I purchased as long term rentals. A lot of them just already had long term tenants in them, and so they made sense as a long term rental, and that still is kind of my backup plan. So converting them over to a short term rental just really improved the income.
Hmm.
That is a little harder to find now, but that's still what I would look for, at least something that I was. So I always run it two ways, basically. If I have there's a property for sale, I will run it and see how I think it'll perform with a long-term tenant. And those rents are pretty easy to find online. You just look up some comparables and see what a three-bedroom home rents for example. And then I would do the same thing for the short term rental side and see, okay, in this same neighborhood, in the same zip code for a comparable property that's also 3 bedroom, what is that renting for? And you can use that company like the one I mentioned, AirDNA, to look up. I would suggest looking at multiple properties in that exact area and see how they've performed in the past, see what their occupancies are, and then just take a conservative number from that and plug it into the calculation.
So you do try to find ones that make sense on a long-term basis, and then if you can kind of apply, get a license short-term, that's even better.
Hmm. Yeah. I would say, I mean, there's a lot of places where they still don't have regulations. And I think it's going to be like that for a really long time. Those aren't, so you got to be careful with those places, right? It's better to invest in a place that has a process, especially if you're only looking to do a short term rental and you don't really have another backup plan. Then you got to make sure you get the license. But a lot of markets, a lot of cities still don't have anything in place. So you do got to be careful with that.
Okay. So you'd rather go into a market where the city has set municipal guidelines.
If I was looking at a rental investment strictly as a short term rental, I would definitely want to make sure that I could get a permit. Or I guess it depends though. Like, because if you're looking at doing 30-night stays, then you don't need a permit most of the time. I mean, you want to check that, but that's a really good strategy too.
Is that viable as a unit, or how would you market it differently? I guess just to make sure everyone's dates line up, right? Where you don't have too much in between, like one month to another, and you can, I guess that you're in a market where there is a lot of like per month rentals.
Yeah, I so the marketing is different. I mean, if someone's going to be basically living in your short-term rental and not just vacationing there or going there for a weekend, then you're going to want to make sure that the property has laundry, that it has parking. So you really have to know your guest avatar, they call it.
Hmm.
Knowing who's going to be staying in your property really helps you determine how you should set up your property and how you should market it. But I would say, just like for a remote worker, for example, and I kind of like relatively large cities because they have a lot of people traveling for work. So you want to make sure you have really good internet. That's kind of a given these days, but you can put a screenshot of the internet right in the listing so someone knows right away. I think having a dedicated workspace is really helpful. And it's also an additional option on Airbnb, for example, now and other listing sites. So the more of those sort of long term reservation amenities you can check off, the more likely someone is to find you that's looking for a longer stay. And then after you've had people stay with you for longer periods of time and you get positive reviews, then your search rankings go up for people looking for those stays.
Hmm.
Um, because it's already like you have a proven medium term rental. Basically, it's got like credibility, I guess you could say. So.
Yeah, it's definitely a snowball. And so you've built up quite the, I guess, portfolio in the United States. What's the next step? Do you try to make it more formal and become like a REIT, or you're going to a big private equity fund to get like a sizable equity investment, or like there's things you can do when you get to that scale.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess I got into real estate to kind of have some freedom and be able to travel when I want. And so I guess right now the thing is, if so all my investments for the most part I've just done on my own. And when you start taking other people's money for investments, you can definitely do much bigger things, but a totally different setup, right? Like to me, it just sounds a little stressful. Not to say that I won't go down that road, but I'm investing with one friend in Medellin. We bought a couple acres of land, and we're building right now. We're going through the architectural plans to build, hopefully around like 15 short-term rentals, and then that'll also be in the same place where I'll live when. Well, depends on what. I think the nightly rates are going to be so high there that I don't even know if I'll want to live there, which is kind of crazy. But that is a little bit different of a project. It's a bigger scale project, and it's not like some of those things that I was mentioning in the U.S., for example. But in Medellin, there's so many remote workers, and it's sort of not a ton of space left to build, especially in the more desirable areas. That I think that these places will stay rented with these medium term tenants just for the long run. So we're kind of building a community. It's going to have like nice green space, got amazing view in there. It'll have a shared pool and all those types of things. Hopefully a restaurant. So it's almost like we're building this one for a lifestyle versus investing in the U.S. where we're taking existing property that's still going to be successful for a real long time because of the amount of people going there. But it's just I guess there's different opportunities in different places now.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the lifestyle side of things because I think that's one of the things that makes you an interesting guest is that you've learned how to manage this portfolio remotely.
Yeah, it was. You know, the funny thing is, it's like if you most people when we get started in real estate, we invest in our backyard. Property we can go to, we can check on, especially short term rental. People think, well, now it's a lot easier. But 8 years ago when I started, the thought of managing a short term rental remotely was not as common. And so a lot of people start in their backyard so that they can go there when there's an issue or something like that. But the moment you go outside of your local market, it doesn't really matter how far it is. I mean, if it's too far for you to drive there last minute, then managing a property that's 100 miles away versus managing a property that's, on the other side of the world, it's kind of, you have to learn the same things. You have to have someone there locally that can help you if you need it. You have to, today we have amazing home automation software and locks and cameras and all that stuff. So we can make sure our properties are safe and we can make sure guests get in. So that part's a lot easier than it was, but managing a property, I guess, that's in a different country versus managing one that's 100 miles away, it's kind of like the same thing. So the moment I left California, I just sort of kind of figured that out or started figuring it out, and trying things out and still perfecting things, There's always new tools and stuff coming out.
What have been your biggest epiphanies managing this remotely?
I guess one that's a big epiphany is that it, and it's sort of, it's really exciting is that it's, managing a short-term rental in one city or managing another country, it still takes all the same processes. So like if you I mean, you can literally do it in the whole world. So it's really exciting. If I get another property tomorrow in the Philippines, like I can plug it into my system and all of our software and all of our operations. And as long as I have a local contact there, a housekeeper, someone to help me, which we can find remotely too, uh, it just goes in the system. So I think that has been an epiphany for me, and something that really excites me is that it just has like a lot of potential for scalability.
What are some of the things people can do to start introducing scale to the short term rental business?
Taking advantage of software, I think that's a definite one. I worked for a software company as I was kind of getting started in my real estate career for quite a while, and we sold software, or I sold software to automotive shops. it was business management software. So it helped them manage their customers, helped them find data and information to repair cars and marketing. It was kind of all in one. And I found that the companies that were using and fully taking advantage of the software, they always outperformed the other automotive repair shops, the ones that were just using the software like more like a calculator. And so I've always been really into using new software, and that's something that can really help you scale. Um, I think another just like kind of quick tip is that if you find yourself doing the same thing multiple times, responding to a question the same way, or some sort of process that's always the same, then you can create some sort of process or procedure for that to help have someone else help you with it. It's so, there's a book that I read that really influenced my career and just kind of everything I do called The E Myth by Michael Gerber.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if you heard of that one, but
I have, yeah.
yeah, it's a great book. And he's all about processes, and so that really influenced me. I try to model most of the things I do after those sorts of systems.
What's the hardest part about the short-term rental business?
Um, I guess reading a negative review. That's never fun. And it's also not something that you can avoid 100% of the time. I mean, we say in my company that the guess is not always right, but it's our job to make them feel that way. And so we always strive to do that. But occasionally you get someone that's just not happy, and reading negative reviews is not a fun one. I would not say that's my favorite thing to do, but it is really important. And so we always respond to every negative review. Sometimes we get reviews that are just totally bogus, and we can have them removed, if it's someone violated our house rules or a rental agreement or something like that. So that's a nice thing. If someone just straight up lied, or they tried to blackmail you, or sometimes someone wants a discount, they say, "I'm going to leave you a bad review if this doesn't happen." Like, so there's situations where you can have reviews removed, but there's a lot to learn from it too. I think one of the nice things about a short-term rental is that they are so transparent. I mean, that's how we decide if we're going to stay in someone's property, based off their reviews. And so that really helps weed out the bad properties. And a bad property with bad reviews isn't going to get booked. So I think it's kind of going back to those processes too. Like, if there's something that you're doing that you have to do multiple times, you can create a process for it. It's same with your short-term rental. If something pops up, a guest has an issue with something, then you're going to hear about it, and you've got to make sure that you fix it so it doesn't happen again. And so most of the time, like when someone's getting started with a short-term rental, if it's their very first short-term rental, they're going to run into a few of these little things that maybe they didn't think of, or they didn't have a response for. But the cool thing is that they're very likely to hear about them, and then they can fix them, and then they aren't an issue in the future.
Hey everybody, hey everybody. Quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co-founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America, and Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information. So on your podcast, the Short-Term Rental Riches podcast, see, I'm getting it. On
Yeah,
the
you got
podcast,
it.
what's one of the core messages that you try to get across to people that you just wish you could hammer in a little bit more?
Um, I guess a core message would be the operations. I mean, there's a right way to operate a short-term rental, and then there's a wrong way to do it. And so my goal with the podcast is just to give bite-size actionable advice to make sure that people are operating their short-term rentals uh, properly, and also with as little headache as possible. So by creating those systems, it helps eliminate some of the headache, also makes it better for the guests. And so I would say that's probably the core one, is just making sure that we're creating systems and processes for our short-term rentals, because they all pretty much operate the same way.
And so is that a lot of what you talk about on the podcast, is helping people implement these systems?
Yeah, I would say that's a big theme. The idea is, the idea of the podcast is investing in short-term rentals, but with a specific focus on short-term rentals. Or I'm sorry, investing in real estate, but with a specific focus on short-term rentals. So sometimes I talk about just the real estate market in general, and opportunities, and threats and weaknesses. A lot of times I talk about tools that I'm using with my personal portfolio, new
Mhm.
software programs, or things that I learned with guests, or things that I learned building my team, or things that I'm still learning. And so it's kind of, I guess, well rounded for anyone with a short term rental, but probably pretty heavily a big theme in the operations for sure.
Yeah, congrats, man. That's so awesome that you were able to build it up to this scale. I think part of it, you definitely had a vision and got in pretty early, and you've definitely been riding the tailwinds of the remote work trend the past couple of years. Was that something
Hmm.
that you kind of, was that part of your original thesis? You said, I see remote work growing, or I see kind of more movement around the United States, or did you just kind of get lucky with this trend? Because I guess you've been doing digital nomad stuff this whole time.
Yeah, I think I definitely got lucky to get in early. It's not as easy as it was 8 years ago. When you just throw a property up online and it's like, oh wow, it's booked. Now there's a little more competition, but I think at the same time, people are still discovering short-term rentals, and so the sort of silver lining with COVID was that everyone started working virtually. People started staying in Airbnbs instead of hotels, maybe because the hotel was closed. And that definitely added a lot of visibility to short term rentals. So I guess I got lucky in that aspect, that I already had a lot of them set up to catch like that wave. But I also think it's just a long term trend that's becoming much more permanent. And I think that the a long-term lease and a short-term stay they're just merging. And in the future, it might be that long-term leases, a year lease for example, is not as common as it is today, because people can work remotely much easier than ever. So I think it's here to stay. People are living in short-term rentals. People are becoming professionals at short-term rentals too. So it is becoming more competitive, but it should be more competitive, I guess. We want people to be able to trust that they can continue to stay at short-term rentals and be able to check in, and not have issues, and have someone that they can reach out to. So I don't know if that answered your question, or if I was just kind of rambling there for a few minutes.
No, this is good. I mean, you definitely have an eye into what the future of leases might look like. It is kind of interesting to think about, because the 1 year or the 3 year lease, these are kind of outdated concepts, needing a guarantor. There's a lot of ways to disrupt this model.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's all real estate investment investing though does come down to demographics. That's why being in an affordable place right now, I think, is a good opportunity, because a lot of people are moving to affordable places. But we also have like millennials, for example, which is the biggest demographic in the U.S., and a lot of them are entering sort of the family stages. The older millennials starting to have children, and that would, I mean, it's not as easy to travel with. I don't have children of my own right now, but I know my brother does, and a lot of friends do, and that's not as easy to travel. So depending on the market, um, demographics, it could be that you have, it's just another thing to consider, I guess.
Hmm. And you're pretty well traveled yourself. You've been to 80 something countries.
Yeah. I traveled a lot and still enjoy traveling. So try to at least a month or 6 weeks every year, kind of explore some new places or go back and revisit old ones that we've been to before. Love traveling.
What was like your peak travel year?
In terms of like how much I traveled or how many places
Yeah,
I
yeah,
went
I
to, I
guess
guess.
like number of countries visited, flights
Uh,
taken.
I'd say so. Probably after my undergrad, or actually it was during it because I studied abroad in Barcelona for a semester, and afterwards, gosh, I don't remember how many places I tried to cram into the smallest amount of time. It was way too many. But that was around Europe and a little easier to travel around Europe, right? Because everything's closer. But I think my idea of traveling today is quite a bit different than it was back then. Like I think a minimum like a week in a place is kind of at a minimum. Back then, I was spending like 3 nights, 2 nights in places, just bouncing around everywhere, backpacking. So it wasn't, you don't get the opportunity to like kind of, especially if you're going to different cultures and stuff. You kind of just hit a couple highlights. And a lot of times the highlights aren't even like real culture. The most touristy places are sort of like sometimes like numb to the actual culture of the place. So I definitely like to spend a little more time traveling now and try to not move around too much.
Yeah, so 80 something countries. I guess that definitely means a little Europe, a little Asia, something like that. But you've made Latin America your home. Why Latin America?
I think that the culture in most Latin American places is just like I just love the energy. People are super nice. Um, the language barrier. Like I love lots of parts of Asia too, but I just could never see living there because the culture is so different and the languages are so different. So I guess it's been a little easier for me to live in Latin America, but probably if I had to choose one thing, I'd just say it comes down to the people and the energy.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely in pretty high energy environments.
Mm.
Medellin, Camboriú. And where were you living in the States most recently? Or when you go back to the States, where do you prefer to spend time? Are you going to California or do you have like a favorite American city?
Let's see here. So all my family lives in California still. So when I go back, I usually visit them. I'd say if I were to live in one, I'll narrow it down to a state, I guess. I would say I'd probably want to live in Florida if I were to live back in the US again. And it just so happens that Florida probably has one of the biggest Latin influences, I think, at least Southern Florida. I know Mexico, California have a lot of Mexican influence too, which is nice. Gosh, I love Mexican food and just the culture and stuff as well. But I'd say I'd probably live in Florida. I like Tampa area and St. Petersburg. I think that's a pretty cool spot.
Yeah, I mean, have you been like all around Latin America?
I have been to most of Latin America. Yeah, like I spent a good amount of time in Argentina. I've been to Chile and Uruguay, and just spent a lot of time in Colombia. I've been to Peru. Yeah, I think I've been to most places except for maybe like Paraguay and Venezuela. Haven't been to Venezuela yet. I'm waiting.
Is that on the horizon?
Yeah, when it's more, I guess comfortable to go there and more regularly available. I think I heard, what is it, Caracas? I think is like the capital.
Hmm.
I heard that's like Medellin, same weather, but it's right on the ocean, which is one thing that is missing in Medellin. So that sounds amazing. I'd love to go there when the timing's right.
It's true. Medellin on the ocean would be a game changer city.
Yeah, yeah, it really would be.
I'm down. Hey, we've had a couple episodes talking about Venezuela, so people can check the archive, especially the one with Andres Villarreal. He that was a pretty good one. He's a real estate agent in Venezuela. Um,
Ah,
yeah.
awesome.
So, would you have what's your favorite between Colombia and Brazil?
Oh, that's a tough one. Well, down here in southern Brazil, it has seasons, so it's gonna start getting colder in around May, and so from like June to November, it's colder down here, and then we'll go back to Medellin, which is eternal spring, as a lot of people refer to it as.
Hmm.
So I love them both, and I would say though, if I spent so much time in Colombia now, like most of my best friends are there. And that's one thing that's sort of missing for me still down here in Brazil. But I would say like if all of them came down to Brazil, I might even spend more time down here in Brazil. I don't know. But I really like them both, kind of for different reasons. Ocean down here, amazing seafood. Um, Colombia, is where most of my friends are at. Amazing weather, like just real familiar with everything. So I definitely like them both.
Hmm. And when you're in Medellin, where do you stay? Like what neighborhood?
In Poblado normally. Um, I lived a little bit in Laureles, but yeah, pretty much Poblado. And again, it's kind of like it's where most of the rest of my friends live, or near Poblado, like in one of the neighboring cities, like Envigado or something. But there is quite a bit of traffic in Medellin now, and so if you're sort of on the other side of town, and like going from Laureles, for example, to Poblado, like it can take you like 45 minutes if there's a traffic. So
That's a good
it's
point.
a big city. It's got a lot of people in it.
Yeah. So you say there's kind of good value in living in walkable areas, living kind of close to the big city where you could like bike in or hop on a quick bus, quick Uber, and kind of have some of that proximity and services without being in like the full out downtown.
Hmm. Yeah, those are sort of the areas that I like to live in personally, and I think a lot of other people do as well. And a lot of people, if referring to international places too, a lot of times expats, digital nomads don't end up buying a car, or having a car. And so they usually use Uber. And the closer we kind of are to things, I think the more convenient it is. And that's still, those are good places to look if you're looking to invest.
You must have some stories from the international real estate. You must have stories with all the stuff. I mean, give
Yep.
me the international story, like either with the Medellin one or with the Camboriú story, something that went wrong in the process, as happens.
Okay, I got one for you since you're in Panama, right?
I am.
So I actually I got deported from Panama back in the day. Is that how you say it? Deported? Or
Sure.
yeah. Yeah. So I was traveling there in from Costa Rica and came in on a bus, and I spent like a couple weeks there, and then I went to fly out to go back. I was living in the US at that time, so I was just sort of traveling there. And when I got to the airport, they took my passport and they were gone for, I don't know, like enough time to where I started stressing and was like, shoot, I'm going to miss my flight. And they came back and they're like, sorry, you're here illegally. We can't let you leave. And I'm like, oh, what the heck? Like,
Because you didn't
why?
get an entry stamp or what?
Because I didn't get an entry stamp. Yeah. Which, I the bus that we took from the northern border of Panama, like everyone got off on the bus and it crossed this bridge, and we walked across the bridge, and then on the other side there was like no one there. So I just got back on the bus and then spent a few weeks in Panama City. And so I didn't know, I know now. I learned my lesson. Like you always have to stamp leaving and entering, but they didn't really have a good way to handle it. So they're like, well, you need to go to immigration and sort it out. And this was on a Friday, so immigration was closed. And so I waited. That was kind of the ironic thing. They're like, you're here illegally, but you have to stay here until you figure this out. So I went to immigration on Monday, that Monday, and they're like, "Sorry, we don't know what to tell you." They're like, "Go to the U.S. embassy." I'm like, "Okay." So I go to the U.S. embassy, and then they say the same thing. They're like, "Sorry, you have to figure this out with Panamanian immigration." So I went back, and finally they're like, "All right, you're deported." Put a stamp in my passport, big illegal stamp, and they're like, "You can't come back here for 7 years." And
Damn.
yeah, it was crazy. And I went to the airport. I had to wait till I had to wait with security down in the airport. Everyone loaded the plane, and I walked in with security. I felt like a prisoner. It was crazy. Um, so yeah, didn't go to Panama for quite a while after that.
But you've
Uh,
been back.
I have, although it's just been in the airport. Like I wasn't even going to the airport, which was pretty big. It's a great connection, especially going to South America. So finally got uh, I actually got it removed. I had a lawyer help me remove it like a couple years earlier, but yeah, there was probably like 5 year period there where I wasn't even stopping there.
Just out of fear.
Yeah, just like I was going to show up and they're like, "Oh, open my passport and see the legal stamp." I gotta say, like going into other countries too. While I was still using that passport, I have a new one now, but it was always
Oh,
like,
are you gonna do this to us?
yeah, yeah, it was, yeah,
Yeah, I would
it
have
was an
definitely
experience.
said I lost my passport at that point and like just gone for the renewal because you would not want to
Yeah,
be presenting that one.
yeah, it was big too. It took up like a whole page.
That's definitely a thing. And so now with Colombia and Brazil, are you a resident of either of these countries now?
Yeah, I have. So I should be applying for my permanent residency in Colombia this year. So I've had an investor visa for almost 5 years, which allows you to apply for the permanent residency. So I'm hoping to get that one. And then down here in Brazil, I have a investor visa also that is temporary for 2 years, but I can turn into a permanent one afterwards. But there's some tax sort of consequences and stuff. You become a permanent resident in Brazil, so I'm still got to kind of figure that one out.
And was that part of your strategy that you wanted to internationalize a bit, get a couple of residency permits, maybe work towards a second passport?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I love having that plan B option or plan C, and just having uh, more more opportunities, I guess. And also, you really fall in love with a different city if in a lot of places, if you don't have most places, if you don't have a visa, you can't spend all year there. And so, yeah, I think that was a big part. Still part of the plan.
Do you see yourself like it must be tough to do the 6 months, 6 months thing. It's something I've considered, and that's kind of what I do to some extent, being like a snowbird. But
Hmm.
it's pretty tough to like do you do it really like 6 months and then 6 months, or do you do like three, you know what I mean? Like shorter periods on and off? Because it's definitely hard to do like a clean break on somewhere where
Hmm.
you've been for 6 months.
Yeah, I would say it's probably like in terms of like cumulative time, it's probably like 5 months in Brazil and 5 months in Colombia, and then that those 5 months are usually broken up when I'm going to conferences or like going to Europe or visiting family in the US. So I don't think it's not like a straight 6 months, but like if you were to add up all the time, it's kind of um, maybe 5 months and 5 months. But I would say like I want to spend the 5 months down here in Brazil because it's summertime down here and it's nice to be next to the beach. Um, and then Colombia doesn't really matter what 5 months you choose because, or at least in Medellin, because the weather's always pretty darn good.
Yeah, it's definitely tough to pick, I'm sure. Because you're kind of like, maybe you go to a conference in the States or something, and you're like, should I go back to Medellin or should I go back to Camboriú? I guess it's a bit seasonal, but it's tough when you have multiple places to be at the same time.
Yeah, I do. Usually, when I go back to the U.S., I try to lump a bunch of stuff together. So, like, if I'm going to a conference, then I'll try to go like visit my family at the same time or something. Cause that's one thing. Like when I'm in Medellin, it's a lot easier to go to the US. It's pretty far from down here in Balneario. I mean, it's like to go to Sacramento, for example, where most of my family lives, it's like an all day thing, minimum 3 flights. And it's a bit of a journey. So I'd say probably a little less travel going on when I'm down here in Brazil, but when I'm up in Colombia, it's a lot easier to travel. So moving around a little bit more at that time.
And how are you doing with the languages?
Pretty good. My Spanish. So I had lived in Spain, and I studied abroad there. I was kind of studying for a while, so that was pretty good. Although I'd say it's and my girlfriend and I would just speak Portuguese. So I feel like my Portuguese is probably better than my Spanish now, or it's like Portugal. They're maybe better than my English. Like my English is definitely getting worse too. I would say, uh, but no, they're good enough to feel comfortable.
That's cool. So you're integrating a little bit. Have you thought about, and you're buying property, which I think is like a great step towards kind of getting involved in the local community. Have you
Hmm.
looked at sort of the startup industry or tech? Because you are a bit of a tech guy, or,
Hmm.
kind of getting more involved in the economy in other ways?
Well, I think one of the exciting things that we're doing now, just recently, actually, within the last few months, is that we started managing other short-term rentals virtually, which is all tech related because it's all virtual. And so we're using all the systems that we put together, all the different tools, all the different programs to help people literally wherever they have short-term rentals. And I guess that in a roundabout way is helping each of those local economies. I mean, a short-term rental really does a lot for a local economy. I mean, people come to visit. A lot of times, if it is a shorter stay, they're going to the restaurants, they're doing all that. The property owners paying transient occupancy tax, which goes to the local city government. And it's a lot. Some of these cities are just making tens of millions of dollars because people are staying in the short-term rentals. And so I guess in a roundabout way, yeah, we're uh, helping manage short-term rentals in its different places, and so that kind of feeds into the local economy.
Hmm. And I actually meant like in Colombia or Brazil. Like, would you ever kind of get involved in the real economy in some way in these countries, or do you kind of have a philosophy of mostly like earning US dollars, spend pesos type of thing?
Well, I actually was talking with my Brazilian friend down here a couple weeks ago about doing more in this market in Brazil, and he lives down here full time. He's lived here for like 20 years, which basically like their management of short-term rentals down here is just they're like 5 years behind the US, and we would be earning real by managing properties that way. I mean, we'd be using all my virtual systems still, but that would be a little more local. What One of the things that I'm excited to do, it's on the drawing board at some point, is to be able to have a charity for younger teens. But like when I went to Spain for the first time, I lived with that family. Like it just totally changed my life. And I left my family household, which wasn't, I don't know, my parents weren't really getting along too well. And I went and stayed with this family, and they were super happy. And it just, gosh, it just totally changed my life. So I want to set up a charity at some point just to be able to sponsor kids, like high school kids, like at that really that age where you're really easily influenced to go live with other families, like just sponsor an exchange program basically. I'd love to do that in sometime in the near future. So I guess again, that's not really like in the local economy, but it's in a roundabout way.
No, no, that's cool. I definitely think we all respect that effort. That's pretty cool. I know we're trying to wrap up. Uh, Where do you think like the most opportunity is for an American? Would you say that an American should maybe cut their teeth first in the U.S. market and start managing stuff there, or should they just go straight into international real estate if they have a passion for living abroad? What are your thoughts on that, like, in building an international portfolio?
I would say the first thing is we really need to kind of figure out exactly what it is that we want. So if our big passion is living abroad, then I think you can make that work. Um, but if you're just looking for investment returns, and if you're an American listening to this, I think as an American, we have the best opportunity in the US, and we can always use US dollars, which go a long way in most of the world now to live wherever we want. So that was sort of my strategy. I think because we have the financing options available as citizens of the US where we wouldn't in other countries, it's just much easier. Um, it's also if you're trying to invest outside of your native country, then there's oftentimes a language barrier. You're not familiar with the market, the rules are totally different. I mean, my property I bought in Colombia, for example, it was owned by multiple people. And a lot of times someone will try to sell a property without even like including the other owner in there. And so I always recommend definitely working with a trusted lawyer or someone that specializes in that. And it's another place where a lot of people get kind of scammed. A foreigner looking to buy property in another place, they come in and they don't know that many people, and just by being a gringo or being someone from the US, a lot of times they just jack their prices up. So you got to really be careful if you're looking to invest internationally in a market that you're not familiar with and you don't know people in. I think the US is by far the easiest, and I also think it's uh easier, and it's got more opportunity.
If you were to buy international real estate, would you do it in a U.S. LLC, or would you do it in your own name, or using a local company from that country?
So that depends because, like, let's say you were looking for a plan B option, right? And you wanted to get permanent residence in Colombia. If you bought it under a company, then you wouldn't be eligible for the residency. So you have to buy it under your personal name. So for me, that's what I did. If you were looking for more protection, I mean, and to be a little more anonymous, then putting something in an LLC or a company, I think, is always going to provide a little more protection. But you just have to make sure that, I guess, it's not limiting you in other ways.
Yeah, so beyond the residency based one, if it was more of like a pure investment play, do you think
hmm
would you buy it with like a US company? And then do you think there's any chance if you got to a certain level of scale and you had, I don't know, like 5, 10 properties in Medellin, but they were owned by a US LLC, that you could maybe start participating in like getting US financing, at least like, a little bit of financing, like 2x or something?
I don't think any U.S. bank um, would finance for a property outside of the U.S. None that I know of. What you can do, though, I mean, if you have equity in your property in the U.S., is you could refinance. You could pull out some of the equity, and then it's up to you what you do with that equity. You could use that to invest overseas, but a bank lending for a property overseas, unless they had a direct connection with that market, then I don't know of any options like that.
It would be cool if I think there's a need for this where I'm starting to see some businesses and ways of providing financing to expats that want to buy properties, let's say in Mexico, and maybe you'd take it like one country at a time, and there must be some way where you can have like, you know as the lender you have an international operation, and so you have boots on the ground in Mexico that can, put a lien on the property, or otherwise, have have rights to the property in Mexico, so that you could potentially like recoup something like that. But I'm starting to see like things hit the market, because there's definitely a huge need where everyone's doing cash deals in Latin America.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely a huge need. I thought about, I mean, like a few years ago, I remember like, oh yeah, I want to start a fund like to finance people down here. And then after talking to lawyers and banks are like, if you want to start a fund, you have to, this was specific to Colombia, but they're like, if you want to be lending here, the Colombian government's going to charge. It was something crazy. It was like a 2% origination fee, and then like a 2% fee on the back end, but like right off the top, which means that you could, like, if you gave someone a loan for 5%, 4% of it was going to the government already. So I don't know. There was just like the tax laws are different in both. Like let's say it's a U.S. company lending in Mexico. Tax laws are different in both countries. Property laws are different in both countries. Um, I guess, ideally it's a bank that has branches in both sides and they somehow figured how to maneuver those differences. Then, yeah, that would be a huge hit. I mean, I don't know of something like that exists right now, but that would be a huge hit. Maybe, blockchain or one of those types of options might make something like that more available. But right now, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, definitely something to think about. We're probably inspiring the audience a little bit, but let's keep thinking about this. If you think of something, hit me back up. Let's get it going, because I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Definitely.
Tim, well, as we're starting to wrap up the episode, do you want to shout out anything or bring attention to anything you have going on to the audience?
I guess I'd just say, if you're interested in short-term rentals or investments, you can check out my podcast, Short-Term Rental Riches. If you already have a short-term rental and you want some help managing it, well, we're happy to partner with you as well. I think there's a ton of opportunity in short-term rentals, like we've talked about today. It's like not going away. Like the way we live is different, and it's going to continue to be different. And I think it's just awesome to be able to experience other parts of the world. So another reason why I like short-term rentals. I guess one just last thing is there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. There always is. If you look for the doom and gloom, there's always going to be doom and gloom. I mean, banks failing, stuff like that, but there's always opportunities too. So if you're planning on buying a place overseas to live abroad, then definitely go for it. The more we figure out, the less fear we have, and the more we make things happen.
Yeah, man, I'm definitely going to be devouring some episodes of the Short Term Rental Riches podcast. How do you film it, like, or record it? Do you just kind of get talking for like an hour and then chop it up into a bunch of different themes? What's your process there?
No, they're actually they're quick, short ones, like usually 10 to 15 minutes, and I just record them one at a time.
One at a time? You don't
I've
you don't try to do like sessions and knock out like a bunch in a day?
Well, yeah, I will record usually like try to record a few at the same time, but they're totally different themes most of the time. And I just started doing a few interviews, and some of those are slightly longer. So I might break those up into a couple. But yeah, most of them are just quick. A lot of times it's something that I'm just working on with my properties, like for example, I'm switching banks that I work with now in the US, and some banks have much better features than others. And I think I found a good option for anyone that has a short term rental, because we got to pay lots of contractors and stuff like that. Like, so that could be an episode
Yeah, there's definitely lots of nuances and operational aspects to consider.
for sure. For sure. Yeah, there
Do you
are.
do you like put like What's like your one or two like quick hacks to get like a 5-star rating? Do you leave them a bottle of wine or chocolate on the pillow, or things like that?
I would say a key component is actually staying in your property and sleeping in it before you have your first guest, because there always seems to be something that you're missing. Like there's a light that shines through the bedroom window and it keeps you up at night, or there's the neighbor has a dog late at night and you don't know about it. So making sure your property is perfectly listed so that it meets the expectations of your guests 100% is a good, like, just mandatory step. I think that's step one. Because most time, as long as our property meets guest expectations and we have quick, good communication, we're going to get a really good review. What you can do if you want to like have better reviews in the beginning, like you could actually put up photos that were slightly worse than the way your property actually looks. Like this happened unplanned with some of my properties, like someone had taken photos and we listed it with like a cell phone photo and they're dark, and the guest shows up and they're like, man, this is way better than the photos. Again, it just comes back to expectations. So you could try that, put up like worse photos right at the beginning, still of the same space, but and then, maybe if you want to charge a little bit less, but it really just comes down to communication and expectations, I think.
I can agree. I'm sure you've been into many Airbnbs in Latin America that were, we call it the Latin hammer. It's where something unexpected happens and either there's a construction site next door or a nightclub or the internet doesn't work or any
Yeah.
number of things. The Latin hammer.
Yeah, for sure. No, there's been some surprises. Yeah.
Well, Tim, this has been a super fascinating episode. I think you're doing what a lot of us want to be doing, building a portfolio of real estate assets, chilling in Latin America on that semi-passive income, buying international real estate as well, getting into some plan Bs and residency stuff. So you definitely seem to be on the right track for sure, man. And we appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's always good to talk to other digital nomads, other people living the way they want to live.
Absolutely. Again, my guest today was Tim Hubbard of the Short Term Rental Riches podcast. Thanks again, Tim.
Thanks, Vance.